Victoria had some of the harshest lockdowns in Australia and possibly the world. Victoria was replete with draconian house arrests, curfews, and penalties whenever people dared to resist overwhelming state power. We can all remember how police greeted the protesters who tried to resist all of these measures, and how that contrasts with how they're responding to all of the protests at the moment. Dan Andrews, the Premier who orchestrated this, not only undermined Victorians' rights, he's also annihilated Victoria's economy, something that's been followed upon by Jacinta Allen, the current Premier. So, for example, Victoria's state debt has skyrocketed. It's increased from around 6% of gross state product when Labor was elected into power to around 24% now, a fourfold increase in proportion to gross state product. Debt now sits at around $156 billion. Victoria is running a budget deficit. Simply servicing the daily interest bill on that debt costs around $15 million. Victoria is going backwards, and Victoria is struggling to pay for this given the state budget deficit. And this begs the question of who then is going to pay for all of this largesse, and who is going to pay for all of the irresponsibility? Well, really, it's going to be the taxpayers. Initially Victorians, and then everyone else when Victoria is simply running out of money. Socialists, it seems, have never seen a tax that they don't like, or a control that they aren't going to go along with. Essentially, they are control freaks that are obsessed with taking other people's money. And Dan Andrews fits into that mold, and Jacinta Allen perhaps even more so. And so it is that the Victorian ALP has increased taxes wherever they can. This has been primarily focused on property taxes, where they're trying to pillory and excoriate property investors, trying to tear down people that have tried to make a better life for themselves. They've done this cynically by painting property owners as worthy of derision, worthy of a tax. They've othered the property owners, tried to make them worth being attacked, torn down, and taxed into leaving the economy. They've made a virtue of bullying people, and they've made a virtue of state-sanctioned theft of the owner's cash flow rights. Little wonder, therefore, that Victorian property investors seemingly are souring on the state. And this ultimately harms Victoria, because it means less property gets built, and the housing crisis gets worse because there's less construction and therefore not enough new properties. Because property investors simply don't want to go along with Victoria because there's no reason to, because they're simply going to be attacked by the government down there. The government doesn't seem to realize that they need investors, they need people to want to work in that economy, they need capital to come in, and all of their measures are doing their best to get rid of capital and to deter it from investing in Victoria. Dan Andrews is largely responsible for this catastrophe. Rather than trying to lift people up, Dan Andrews and the Labour Party want to tear people down. They're the archetype of the bad old days of Australian tall poppy syndrome, something that Australia has been trying to move along from. However, Dan Andrews and the ALP and Jacinta Allen seem to want to keep dragging Australia back into some bad old policies. Australia tries to get ahead and innovate and improve its economy, but Dan Andrews and the ALP want to hold things back. They want to attack success and anyone who dares to try to make a better life for themselves. Dan Andrews is the problem. Jacinta Allen is the problem. The ALP is the problem. A related issue, of course, is that the Liberal Party has been a very ineffective opposition across all states, but in particular Victoria, where they seem to not really know what they stand for, whether they stand for or against a voice, whether they stand for or against improving the economy, whether they stand for or against all of the left-wing policies that Dan Andrews et al. Want to bring along. The opposition has really not been very good, and it has started to resemble a bit of a uni party. Little wonder, therefore, that people seem to be rather jaded on the political process within Victoria. So to use a metaphor, Dan Andrews is the person who breaks his hand punching you in the face and then mugs you to pay for his hand surgery. But despite all of this incompetent, divisive and cynical policy making, Dan Andrews has actually been rewarded, not penalised. The whole sham COVID inquiry seems to have gone nowhere because the state premiers were exempted from it, but Dan Andrews has in fact been rewarded in the King's birthday honours. He's been made a companion of the Order of Australia, despite being incompetent and manifestly unworthy of such an honour. This makes a mockery of the system for a few reasons. First, not only is he receiving the award because he was simply doing his job, so to speak, of being premier, but he was doing his job badly. He's being rewarded for being a terrible premier. It is a farce. It smacks of political shenanigans or ideological capture. It also sends a terrible message, because you can simply do your job, so to speak, and do it badly and be rewarded. He's effectively failing upwards. He's being rewarded for incompetence. He's being rewarded for treating Victorians like mugs. He's being rewarded for annihilating Victorians' rights and annihilating Victoria's economy, and making both Victorians and everyone else pay for it. But it gets worse. Mark McGowan, the Premier of Western Australia, was also made a Companion of the Order of Australia, the highest honour in the King's Birthday Awards. Now you might recall that Mark McGowan was in charge of shutting Western Australia from the rest of Australia, an isolationist approach that was never going to be sustainable. Now Mark McGowan was less of a catastrophe than Dan Andrews, but it still wasn't exactly very competent. Notably, for example, the premiers of some of the less bad states, so New South Wales for example, so Gladys Berejiklian or Dominic Perrottet, were not so rewarded, which stands in stark contrast because they did a slightly less terrible job than, for example, Dan Andrews and Mark McGowan. And not only that, Australia's incoming Champagne Socialist Governor-General, Sam Mostyn, has been made a Companion of the Order of Australia as well. So we're seeing 3 Labour acolytes being rewarded with the highest honour. One would almost wonder whether there were a political test being imposed on being rewarded in the King's Birthday honours. Of course, we would never know for sure, but it does make people think. Notably, as I indicated, none of the Liberal premiers were so rewarded. Now, of course, we'll never know for sure whether or not there was any political interference, and we can only speculate at the moment. But it sure does look bad. 3 Labour leaders being given the highest honour in 1 year. It looks curious, especially when one of them was so manifestly incompetent and was never deserving of any such honour. And if anything, he was deserving of being shunned. Now, of course, I have some sympathy for Victorians who were saddled with such a premier. However, my sympathy is a little bit limited when they keep voting in these clowns. This has recently manifested in Jacinta Allen, who seemingly is going all in on a treaty that people simply don't want unless they live in the inner city of Melbourne. Now, I feel sorry for the Victorians that are stuck with these premiers despite voting against them. However, my sympathy is limited when people keep voting for these clowns. Now, as I've indicated, the Liberal Party hasn't been an effective opposition. However, an ineffective, slightly useless party is probably better than one that makes things actively significantly worse. Now, I'd say that people who don't want Jacinta Allen or Dan Andrews or people like that should immigrate to New South Wales or to Queensland, but only if they leave their stupid policies behind in Victoria, because no one wants to turn into such a basket case, and no one wants Victoria's policies. Now, of course, the unfortunate thing about state politics is the opposition always seems to be a little bit mediocre. Unfortunately, however, it does appear that these politicians are going to remain in power for the foreseeable future. But let me know your thoughts about Dan Andrews and him being rewarded for his incompetence in the comments below. I'd be interested to hear what you think.